In the winter of 1944, while American families gathered around their radios to follow the distant thunder of war across Europe and the Pacific, something extraordinary and almost entirely invisible was crossing the sky above them. It made no sound, it left no contrail, it carried no pilot, and yet it traveled more than 5,000 miles, riding winds that no military strategist had ever thought to weaponize, drifting at altitudes where the air was thin and the cold absolute, descending silently over forests and farmland and mountain ranges that had never known the touch of enemy ordnance. Most Americans who were alive during the Second World War never knew it happened. The United States government made certain of that, but it happened nonetheless, thousands of times, in what remains one of the most audacious, unconventional, and quietly devastating weapons programs in the history of modern warfare. Japan called them Fugo. The name was utilitarian, almost bureaucratic in its brevity, offering no hint of the ambition embedded within the program. But the ambition was staggering. Beginning in late 1944 and continuing through the early months of 1945, the Imperial Japanese military launched approximately 9,000 balloon bombs from the eastern coastline of Honshu, the main island of Japan. These were not crude or improvised devices. They were the product of years of meteorological research, engineering ingenuity, and a particular kind of strategic desperation that emerges only when a nation senses the tide of war shifting against it. Each balloon was designed to cross an ocean, descend on a continent, and deliver destruction to the homeland of an enemy that believed itself safely separated from the battlefield by thousands of miles of open water. The Pacific Ocean, long understood as the United States' greatest natural defense, was not an obstacle Japan intended to respect. To understand how such a program came to exist, it is necessary to step back and appreciate the state of the war from Japan's perspective by mid-1944. The imperial advance that had once stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the borders of India had stalled and then begun to reverse. American industrial production, fully mobilized, was outpacing Japanese capacity at every level. Island by island, the United States was pushing westward across the Pacific, and Japanese commanders understood with growing clarity that the war they had begun so dramatically at Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was turning in ways they could no longer control through conventional means. The bombing of the Japanese home islands, which would eventually culminate in the firestorms of Tokyo and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had not yet begun in earnest, but Japanese military planners could read the strategic map. They needed to find ways to strike back, to extend their reach, to remind the American public that war carried consequences. And they needed to do it without aircraft carriers or long-range bombers they could no longer afford to risk or no longer possess in sufficient numbers. The idea of weaponizing atmospheric currents was not born from desperation alone. It was born from science, specifically from the work of Japanese meteorologists who in the early 20th century had begun studying the high-altitude wind systems that flow across the North Pacific. These rivers of air, moving at speeds that could exceed 200 miles per hour at altitudes between 30,000 and 40,000 feet, would eventually become known to the world as the jet stream. Western meteorologists were simultaneously developing their own understanding of these phenomena, but Japanese researchers had been paying particularly close attention to their behavior over the Pacific, and by the late 1930s they had accumulated enough data to understand something remarkable. These winds moved from west to east, consistently, seasonally, and with enough velocity to carry a sufficiently buoyant object across the ocean in 3 to 4 days. The question that occurred to Japanese military planners was as simple as it was startling. Could a balloon, properly designed and carefully constructed, ride those winds from Japan to North America? The answer, after years of research and development, was yes. but the engineering required to make that answer operational was formidable. A balloon capable of carrying an explosive payload across the Pacific would need to maintain a specific altitude range throughout the journey, and it would need to do so autonomously, without any human guidance, across an ocean that offered no landing strips, no refueling stations, and no way to course correct if something went wrong. The atmosphere, unlike the ocean surface, is not a stable highway. Temperatures change, winds shift vertically as well as horizontally. A balloon that ascended too high in the cold night air would risk rupturing as the gas inside expanded. One that descended too far during the warmer daylight hours would lose altitude and potentially crash into the ocean before reaching its destination. Maintaining a precise operational altitude over 5,000 miles of open water was a problem that required an elegant, self-regulating solution. The answer the Japanese engineers developed was an altitude control system of almost clockwork simplicity. Each balloon was fitted with a barometric sensor connected to a series of sandbag ballast weights and a set of hydrogen venting mechanisms. When the balloon dropped below a predetermined altitude, the sensor would trigger the release of a small sandbag, reducing the weight of the payload and allowing the balloon to ascend again. When it rose too high, a valve would vent a controlled amount of hydrogen, allowing the balloon to descend. The system was passive, automatic, and required no human input. It was, in its own way, an early form of autonomous control technology, a self-correcting machine operating in an environment no human could survive for any extended period, making decisions based on air pressure alone. The balloons would cycle through these corrections thousands of times during their journey, rising and falling within their target altitude band like a ship riding ocean swells, always moving east. The balloons themselves were engineering achievements that deserve more recognition than history has typically afforded them. They were constructed from washi, the traditional Japanese paper made from the inner bark of the kozo plant, which had been used in Japan for more than 1,000 years for everything from manuscripts to sliding screen panels. Washi was chosen not out of sentimentality, but because of its physical properties. It was remarkably strong for its weight, flexible enough to expand and contract without tearing, and available in large quantities from a production network that could be organized without attracting Allied intelligence attention. The sheets were laminated together using a paste made from konnyaku, a starchy root vegetable that produced a natural adhesive capable of bonding the layers into a single airtight membrane. Each balloon required hundreds of individually crafted paper panels, carefully shaped and joined into a sphere roughly 33 feet in diameter when fully inflated. At full size, the balloon could contain 19,000 cubic feet of hydrogen, enough lift to carry itself, its control mechanism, its ballast sandbags, and its ordnance payload across an entire ocean. The ordnance itself was compact but deliberate. Each balloon carried a central incendiary device and a series of smaller anti-personnel bombs or additional incendiaries, depending on the particular configuration of any given unit. The primary strategic intent was fire. Japan's military planners understood that the forests of the American Pacific Northwest and the agricultural regions of the interior West were vulnerable to wildfire, and they envisioned waves of balloon bombs starting thousands of fires across a continent already stretched thin by wartime demands. The psychological dimension was equally important. If American civilians understood that their own cities and forests were burning as a result of Japanese attack, the domestic pressure on the United States government to divert military resources toward homeland defense might slow the advance in the Pacific. It was a strategy born from the same logic that had led European powers throughout history to attack civilian infrastructure, not necessarily to destroy armies, but to erode the will that sustained them. Production of the Fugo balloons was organized on an industrial scale that drew in significant portions of Japan's civilian workforce. Young women and schoolgirls were mobilized in large numbers, working in factories, theaters, and converted public halls, carefully cutting and gluing paper panels under strict conditions designed to maintain consistent humidity and prevent damage to the delicate material. The workers were not always told precisely what they were making. Security around the program was serious, though its secrecy ultimately proved more effective in the United States than in Japan, where the existence of a balloon weapon program was known widely enough that American intelligence eventually received fragmentary reports through intercepted communications and other channels. The scale of production required to launch 9,000 balloons represented a genuine commitment of resources at a moment when Japan's industrial capacity was under severe strain, which speaks to how seriously the military establishment regarded the program's potential. The launch sites were established along the northeastern coast of Honshu, chosen for their proximity to the jet stream's seasonal position above the Japanese islands. The launches themselves were carefully timed to take advantage of the strongest and most consistent high-altitude winds, which tended to occur during the late autumn and winter months. Beginning in November 1944, the balloons began ascending into the cold Pacific sky, one after another, day after day, carried upward until they caught the river of air flowing high above the clouds and began their silent eastward journey. Japanese military planners could not know precisely where each balloon would come down because the jet stream's behavior over the interior of the North American continent was far less well understood than its behavior over the Pacific. They knew their weapons would reach North America. They could not know which valley or forest or town would receive them. As winter deepened, the balloons began arriving. The first confirmed recovery on the North American side of the Pacific occurred in December 1944, when fragments were found in the state of Montana. Over the following months, balloon components, unexploded ordnance, and the scattered remains of hydrogen envelopes would be recovered from Alaska and the Yukon to California, from Oregon and Washington and Nevada to as far east as Michigan and Iowa. They came down in forests and on frozen lakes and in remote desert canyons where they would not be found for weeks or months. Some detonated immediately upon landing, others hung in trees or settled into snowfields, their ordnance intact and waiting. The geography of their arrival reflected the imprecision that was inherent in the system. The jet stream was a general delivery mechanism, not a targeting instrument, and it deposited its cargo with the indifference of weather, not the intention of a marksman. The United States military recognized relatively quickly that something unprecedented was happening. The fragments recovered in Montana were identified as originating from Japan, and within weeks the government had assembled a task force to study the weapon and coordinate a response. The response they chose was not military, but informational, or rather, anti-informational. In January 1945, the Office of Censorship issued a directive requesting that American newspapers, radio stations, and other media outlets refrain entirely from reporting on the balloon bombs. The reasoning was strategic. If the Japanese military received no confirmation through American news sources that their balloons were reaching North American territory, they would have no way to assess the program's effectiveness, which might lead them to conclude it was failing and abandon it. The American press, operating under the wartime culture of voluntary censorship that had become standard practice since Pearl Harbor, complied. The balloons continued to fall, and the American public continued not to know. The effectiveness of the information blackout is one of the more striking chapters in the history of wartime censorship. In a country with a free press and a tradition of aggressive reporting, thousands of military personnel, local law enforcement officers, farmers, loggers, and ordinary civilians encountered strange objects in their fields and forests, reported them to authorities, and then fell silent as requested. the system worked. Japanese intelligence, monitoring American news for any acknowledgement of the balloon campaign, found nothing. In the spring of 1945, the Japanese military concluded that the program was a failure and wound it down, halting production and suspending launches. They never knew that their balloons had, in fact, successfully crossed the Pacific in significant numbers. They never knew that the forests of Oregon and Washington had been set briefly alight in scattered places, that military installations in Montana had been overflown by drifting hydrogen spheres, or that the continental United States had been subjected to a sustained aerial bombardment campaign lasting more than 6 months. The censorship killed the program as effectively as any countermeasure could have. But the program produced consequences that could not be censored. On the 22nd of May, 1945, in a wooded area near the small town of Bly in southern Oregon, an elderly woman named Elsie Mitchell and 5 children ranging in age from 11 to 13 set out on a fishing trip with her husband, a minister named Archie Mitchell. Archie went to park the car. Elsie and the children wandered into the trees. One of the children noticed something strange on the ground and reached toward it. The resulting explosion killed Elsie Mitchell and all 5 children, the only American civilians to be killed by enemy action on the continental United States during the entire Second World War. Archie Mitchell survived to describe what happened. The community of Bly was devastated, and the military's response was to redouble efforts to keep the incident from the press, fearing that any publicity would compromise the censorship that was already proving so effective at limiting Japanese intelligence. The families of the dead were asked to maintain silence. Most did, because they were asked in the language of patriotism and wartime duty, and because they lived in a moment when such requests carried a weight that is difficult to fully recover today. The tragedy in Oregon remains, even now, a haunting footnote to a conflict that produced so many larger tragedies that smaller ones tend to disappear. But the story of the Fugo program is not merely a story about death and silence. It is a story about the nature of strategic innovation, about how military necessity drives minds toward solutions that would otherwise seem fantastical, and about how the oldest natural systems of the planet can be enlisted as instruments of war. The Japanese engineers and meteorologists who designed the balloon bomb program did something genuinely remarkable. They recognized that the atmosphere itself was a mechanism, that the planet's circulatory system of wind could carry mass from one side of an ocean to the other, and they built a device capable of exploiting that recognition in a practical, repeatable, scalable way. The fact that the program ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives does not diminish the intellectual achievement at its core. It also speaks to the degree to which scientific knowledge, even incomplete scientific knowledge, can become a weapon. The Japanese understanding of the jet stream in 1944 was imperfect, particularly with respect to the stream's behavior over the American interior, which is why so many balloons came down in unpopulated areas and why the fires they started were limited in scope. But the foundational insight was correct. The upper atmosphere was a transportation network, and it ran from Japan to North America on a schedule that could be predicted with reasonable accuracy. Within a generation of the Fugo program, that same insight would underpin the science of intercontinental missile trajectories, atmospheric nuclear testing patterns, and the entire modern field of global atmospheric modeling. The Japanese military, in weaponizing the jet stream, was also, inadvertently, demonstrating something about the interconnectedness of the planet that would take decades for civilian science to fully articulate. There is something almost mythological about the image of those balloons in flight. 9,000 paper spheres rising from the coast of Japan and crossing the largest ocean on Earth, each one a self-regulating machine making thousands of autonomous decisions about altitude and ballast, each one carrying its small cargo of destruction toward a continent it would never see described on a map. They flew through days and nights, through storms that should have torn them apart, and inversions that confused their barometric sensors, through the absolute cold of the upper atmosphere where no bird flies and no human has ever breathed unaided. Most of them came down harmlessly, in forests and deserts and on the slopes of mountains, their sandbags released one by one into the wilderness, their hydrogen vented into the sky, their incendiaries dudding in the snow or the mud without igniting. A few did not. A few started fires. A few killed people. And then the Japanese stopped launching them because the silence from America told them they had failed. The censorship succeeded. The program ended. The balloons already in the air continued coming down through the spring and into the early summer of 1945, their payloads slowly growing more dangerous as weathering compromised the structures designed to keep the ordnance stable. The military continued to recover and destroy them where they could. Some were never found. There are credible reports of unexploded Fugo components discovered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest decades after the war ended, and some researchers believe that unknown numbers may still rest in remote locations, their paper long since dissolved, their metal components slowly corroding in the soil. The war passed them by. The peace passed them by. They remain where they fell. Monuments to an idea that was simultaneously brilliant and futile, a weapon system that crossed an ocean only to be undone by the silence of the country it was sent to destroy. What makes the Fugo program so enduringly fascinating is the particular way it reveals the texture of wartime desperation and ingenuity. Japan in 1944 was not a nation capable of building the vast air armadas that were then devastating German cities or the submarine fleets that had nearly strangled British supply lines. What Japan had was knowledge, specifically meteorological knowledge, and the willingness to apply that knowledge in ways that conventional military thinking had not imagined. The balloon bomb was not a weapon of strength. It was a weapon of intellectual audacity, of the determination to find a path through or around an adversary's advantages rather than meeting those advantages head-on. That it ultimately failed does not change what it represented, a genuine attempt to bring the consequences of war home to a population that had, so far, experienced it only at a safe remove, through newspaper photographs and radio broadcasts, and the telegrams that arrived at doors across the country bearing news that no family wanted to receive. In the end, the Pacific Ocean held. The forests of Oregon did not burn. The American public never knew, until after the war was over and the censorship lifted, that their skies had been crossed by enemy weapons for months on end. But the knowledge that it happened, that 9,000 paper balloons once rode the jet stream from Japan to North America, carrying bombs through the winter sky, adds a strange and quieting dimension to the familiar story of the Second World War. The war was not only fought in the trenches of islands, or the engine rooms of destroyers, or the cockpits of fighter planes. It was fought in this one extraordinary chapter, in the upper atmosphere itself, in the invisible rivers of air that circle the globe at the edge of human reach, in the space between the weather and the stars, where the planet's oldest winds still blow east, always east, across an ocean that has never truly divided anything at all.